try it out. All right, so, you know, I want to take us on a voyage today a little bit, you know, beginning to address this place. As I said, you know, we're in Colorado for centuries. Well, I'm in Colorado currently, what's been known as Colorado. And as Gracie shared with us, it's important to remember, you know, not only has for centuries been, but continues to be populated by Indigenous people. And I really think it's important to share who we are and where we're from for everyone, especially for non-Native and non-Indigenous folks. But I also want to use this to start off with what I hope will be a journey we can all go on together. And I'd be learning with you along the way. So yeah, maybe I have some expertise, but I also am still working through a lot of things. So today I want to start actually in a place that's near and dear to my heart, which is Guahan. And I'll try to share these photos with you. Guahan means we have. It is also referred to as Guahan, or a place that has, because it is abundant. So this place is Itanumami, our home. And throughout my work, my heart and my mind are always connected and invested in this potential of Guahan as a way to reorient our understanding of maybe what the Europeans said about this place in the past. So you might know, or you might not, that in this exact spot in Guahan, which is in the southern part of our island in Fua Bay, it's the place where Ferdinand Magellan was said to have made his historic landing to the island 1521, which is nearly 500 years ago. And you know, then continuous occupations by Spain, Japan, and currently the US nation state. You know, really, if you think about it, these are modern nation states with a relatively short history, pretty ill-equipped, and yet honestly taken for granted as a core kind of political entity, a place that can govern peoples that have actually been successfully governing and taking care of themselves and their places for a long time. Now, you might not know much about Guahan, so I'm going to go through a series of kind of like maps and showing you these places, but I also want to remind us that these places are vibrant and full of life and full of people and full of stories. So sometimes maps are useful to show you where things are, but I also really want to make sure we highlight the stories of these places. So I'll take you to a mural here that was actually painted for that area of Fua Rock, Fua Bay, which has our creation stories. And one of the things that's really helpful about that to think about is that at Fua Rock in Fua Bay, there's a Chamorro creation story that tells the story of siblings that work together to create not only the skies and the land and the waters, but also the people, Itaro. And the Tautautono are people of the land. That's our phrase for ourselves. So our land is obviously very important to us. And that's something we share with a lot of other peoples around the world. So this is a contemporary, you know, mural that's painted in the area of Umatic near the bay that I just showed you. And I love the vibrant colors. And I also like how it reminds us that we for thousands of years have known how to take care of ourselves, right? And so this is a story I want us to start with, because some of the other stories I'm going to tell are not as nice to look at, right? Not as nice to hear. And yet it's an important reality, right? So this is a zoomed in kind of map of the area known as Micronesia. Guahan is part of the, Guahan is part of the archipelago of the Marianas. I'm not sure why these are dinging at me, excuse me. But you know, this place that I wanted to highlight is the Mariana Islands as part of Micronesia. These places have these imposed names. We actually refer to the Mariana Islands with different terminology. Laguas Zangani is the name of our archipelago. And so I'm showing this map because even though in some ways you might think, say, situated in the institutions that you're at or wherever you are zooming in from, oftentimes the physical distance of where Guahan is, or Guam is seen as a reason to ignore it, right? So I wanted to start from that place in these maps because it's helpful. And it's also some of the ways I often have to structure my conversations, my writing and talks, because audiences might be a little familiar, but they might be also completely unfamiliar with where and what these islands are. Even though for the case of Guam, it's designated by the US as an unincorporated territory, even though it's considered quote unquote American, right? It's really much more complex than that. And it's a much deeper history. And these places, even though seemingly far away, are actually pretty well connected to US federal laws that have decided that we're part of, sort of a possessive framework. And so most maps don't really show the islands very, very much. These, you might notice from this map that the words for the islands are actually bigger than the dots that represent the islands, right? And I think that's another important piece of the way that we think. And then the other thing is, I've found various maps over the course of my work to try to show people, a little bit more about where this place is situated, because this one is kind of interesting to me with all these red lines coming out of it, because it almost showcases that even though most of the time people don't know where Guahan is or what Guahan is, it's actually a really core component of the United States military strategy. And that military strategy is wreaking disastrous havoc throughout the area. And we know that the environment isn't something that you can really contain. And so this massive military plans that I'm going to talk about just a little bit today really showcases this bigger policy that's being imposed by the United States as part of their realignment. And some of that realignment actually really impacts our Asian and Asian American communities and diaspora and otherwise, because it is part of the United States policy to do things like contain China in the rise to global power, right? And so the buildup that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit is actually looking at relocating US military forces out of Japan, out of Okinawa in particular, by relocating thousands of US Marines to Okinawa and spreading them to bases throughout Oceania. So that includes thousands of troops, about 5,000 at this point, to Guahan. There's an estimated 2,700 troops that they will be sending to Hawaii, and then about 1,300 troops to Australia. And so I think, this map really is an interesting one to me from a communication standpoint, because it kind of communicates that you just use Guahan as a site to go elsewhere, right? Rather than really recognizing the importance of it on its own terms. And then, of course, these red lines are places where, the US military, the US foreign or federal legislation and policymakers are really situating their scope. And then, kind of taking it in a little further, I zoom in on this map because these maps show current control in Guahan, where roughly 27 to 30% of the island, depending on kind of what you're considering, is under occupation by the US Department of Defense. And I think that term occupation is particularly important. So on the left-hand side, you've got one kind of more recent graphic with yellow that says Department of Defense land, which I would contest that label. But basically the Department of Defense has decided that this is the land that they control. And on the right, it's a similar map, a little bit more dated, but the red represents what the US considers to be its land holdings on the island. And I know we're in the Zoom room, and I didn't mention this at the beginning, but if people want me to pause or go back or anything like that, please feel welcome to unmute or raise your hand physically or otherwise. But yeah, so I'm sort of situating, that difference of the story that I told at the beginning of the creation story with the way that other stories are told about us, right? And then, another thing that I wanted to highlight here is a different kind of map on the right-hand side, which is our whole archipelago, right? So one of the things that I really want to show, even though I'm going to be talking more specifically about what's happening in one island, is that we're connected to an archipelago called the Marianas, named after, from the Spanish colonization times, named after the Queen. But, the Marianas are actually politically divided because of their relationships with the United States and their distinct histories with colonial control, but they're still continuing to organize. And one of the things that's really exciting, I think, is that today Guahan and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which are basically, you see this line here on the right-hand side of the map that kind of separates Guam as a US territory with all these other islands, the other 14 islands in our archipelago, as if we're totally disconnected because we have these different political status arrangements with the US. But really, one of the exciting things about Solidarity has been happening is that despite the Department of Defense effort to separate and to really have different kinds of military build-up projects in these different islands, the islands are coming together, working towards, through local community organizing, working towards challenging the Department of Defense to really stop the training and testing efforts that they're putting onto the land, into the water, into the air. And these are stories, I think, that are really important for us. So I've been really reading poetry and getting into creative outlets. I think it's an important way for healing in general, but particularly these days. And I appreciate how one of the groups called Our Commonwealth, 670, they had made their own map, a poetry map, if you will, here on the left. It says, what harms one island harms the whole archipelago. There is no such thing as, quote, sacrificing one island for the sake of the whole. And this really stood out to me because it's an example of one of the efforts that's taking place currently to connect Guahan with the other parts of the archipelago in combined efforts to challenge the Department of Defense. Because we know that contamination and we know that explosive ordinances cannot be contained or mitigated. We know that there is harmful impacts coming to and already being implemented in Guahan, and that is definitely going to impact our archipelago. And it's March right now. There's a ton going on, and from the earlier map that I showed where the islands are situated, in terms of Micronesia, it's important also to connect with the fact that we're very close physically to the Marshall Islands. March 1st marked Nuclear Victims Remembrance Day, but that's an ongoing struggle in the areas of Oceania to commemorate, to remember, and to think about the ways that nuclear testing that happened in the 1950s in the Marshall Islands still has impacts on our communities. So those are some of the things I wanted to say to sort of situate what I'll be talking about further, but I also wanted to bring those connections to bear because in Guam, there's an ongoing conversation. This is a headline from the Guam Daily Post in earlier this year, 2021, talking about PARS, which is the Pacific Association for Radiation Survivors, and their advocacy work to welcome the island community to join in the efforts to address the impacts that militarism and especially nuclear testing and nuclear training has had on our communities in terms of radiation and those kinds of things. And I connect that a lot to what's happened and happening in Colorado, right? Like there's a lot of military bases, contaminants and issues that are of concern for folks living in this area. And those are things that we should be paying attention to. Okay, so kind of bringing in a lot of stuff, I know, but one of the things I wanted to share is that, there is a lot of global solidarity efforts that are taking place. So I'll give a couple of highlights. This is a screenshot of a website, but you can check out the website more. And like I said, I'm happy to share these resources with everyone. There's a global, international, and intersectional solidarity effort from community groups. One organization that I wanted to highlight today is the International Women's Network Against Militarism. And on their website, they have a lot of different resources, even some of the things that they've been doing through webinars during the pandemic that really talk about how, despite the fact that things have been closed down and people really can't connect as much and travel is really restricted, the military has still been maintaining their training and testing. They've still been going out and practicing, war games and those kinds of things. And so this is something that the Women's Network has really been challenging, right? And it's one of a couple of groups that I'll mention today that are really showing how efforts to bring in Indigenous knowledge and practices, to collaborate, to bring community education, to have coordinated actions, even in a pandemic, really can help us address these similar issues. One of those main issues is understanding the military budget, right? And it's a complicated thing because most of the people involved in these groups that I'm talking about, myself included, come from families that are heavily enlisted in the US military, right? So it's really trickiness. But to have conversations about things like military budgets, the violence that comes from some of these everyday routine activities, the health and environmental impacts, not just caused by war, but the preparation and the training and testing that leads to that, and all of the issues that come about from operations, routine operations at military bases. So this is one organization, and the organization highlighting here is important because it's been one of the ones that have connected a lot of different places around the world that have heavy military presence, right? So Korea, Okinawa, obviously the United States, Puerto Rico, Vieques, there's a lot of different places that have been coming together. And I wanted to share some of their actions. Here's a picture here of members of the Women's Network. They're actually meeting in Guahan. They're addressing common issues throughout Okinawa and Guahan. And in the background, there's a sign that was put up that says, U.S. military must not jeopardize Yanburu's forests bid for World Heritage status. So we have some connections across our islands because in Okinawa, in the northern part of Okinawa, in Takai, the region of Takai, they're struggling against the construction of helipads, U.S. military helipad aircraft, and that happens to be taking place in a forest that is on the list to be recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So when I'm talking about challenging militarism and thinking about sustainable futures, part of that is thinking about how the environment continues to be used and abused and destroyed, and areas desecrated for the purpose of the military. At the same time, there's a lot of excitement, I think, in the sense of energy and effort and power of the people to challenge these military structures. Because of the transfer of the massive numbers of military personnel, the construction contracts, the military operations that are planned in the region, it's really given people a number of resources to be able to address the different components of the military buildup as connected, right? So it's rather than just say, okay, that's Okinawa's problem, or, the helipad issue is in Takai, it's recognizing the ways that those are also going to impact and have been impacting places like Guahan, right? So there's a number of things like, sometimes it's inundating to share all of the plans of like, this is everything that the military is planning on doing. But one of the things that I wanted to make sure to highlight is that we have regional similarities. And so let me find this. Okay. Going back to pictures that I appreciate. So this is a picture of the area called Litexan, or Ritidian in English. So I'm taking us, still in another part of the island in Guahan. This is in the northern part of our island. And it's actually one of the preferred sites that the military has chosen for a live fire training range. What that basically means is that Litexan, this area, and some of the research that I've published, but also just kind of some of the thinking that I'm doing, continuing about this space, is how to deal with the fact that the military plans to use this area for its training and testing that would require destroying thousands of acres of our limestone forest, obviously upsetting the flora and fauna that are there. This area happens to look really awesome for a lot of people to see. It's like, wow, it's very beautiful. And at the same time, it's closest to one of our main freshwater aquifers on the island that services about 90% of the fresh water for the island. And, there are a lot of species that are there. It shouldn't really, to me, it shouldn't really matter how much flora and fauna or pristine, environmental things are there. It shouldn't be the only thing that matters, I guess I should say, because the live fire training range that they're planning to put in this area is looking at something like, 18,000 bullets a day, noise pollution. Stray bullets, of course, are not just going to go into one spot where they can be easily picked up without contamination. We know that we have ancient burial grounds there and ancient coral that tells stories of our history. We know that these chemicals and heavy metals and contaminants will leach into our aquifer. So these are other reasons why it would be important to provoke or to prevent, excuse me, the way that the military is kind of orienting to our land. And Letexan, you can't maybe see it very well from this picture, but that is a Chamorro word. It means a place of stirring, because we have really rough waters offshore in this area, and it's a sacred area. It's got significant cultural sites, right? So these are stories that are told from our ancestors that are really offering us a lot of important wisdom that we won't have access to in a world where the firing range is allowed to continue. Now, I will say it is under construction, but part of the hope and understanding, and one of the things I wanted to continue sharing about these groups, is that that's not the only story. So I'll leave this up for just a moment, because if you don't know about this group called Protehi Letexan Save Retidian, I encourage you to check it out. It was formed in 2017 as part of concerned Guahan community members, many of which are indigenous Chamorros, other settler communities, coming together to put this organization out there that would really challenge the Department of Defense, for choosing this area for a live fire training range, and to really put out there the information about the significance of our not only historical sites, but the ongoing need to protect our culture and our environmental resources. And then what's so great, I think, about going to these kinds of places is that you can literally get the knowledge, right? You can literally see how people interact in place. So this is another picture, is more zoomed in on Letexan with actually some of our traditional landowners, different generations of the traditional landowners who have ancestral ties to this exact area of the island. And in going through that area, allowing people to experience it. And that's something that we are seeing with the work of Protehi Letexan, is to tell the stories, to take people to the sites, and to experience it, so that firsthand they can understand why in a lot of ways, obviously a live fire training range is not ideal, but also to demonstrate the power that people continue to have to tell stories and to learn from these landscapes. And so I like these kind of photos, because it also is very different than what the look of a military map that shows it as just a firing range, right? And I'm going to connect this as well to what's happened a little bit more with regard to solidarity. So I know I'm kind of weaving back and forth with different sites and stuff, and hopefully you're not getting too seasick with me, but bear with me for a moment here. We've got this screenshot from another local news outlet in Guam, and it's from 2019, late 2019. It says, Protehi Letexan to Okinawa governor, not all of Guam supports the marine relocation. And this is an image of Governor Leon Guerrero speaking on those issues. And so I just bring this up too, because again, looking at the International Women's Network, looking at Protehi Letexan as an organization, recognizing the commonalities among the struggles, right? So to be able to have voice and to raise concerns from the government of Guahan, which is also facing, the inundation and the different kinds of policies that the US is imposing, similar to the way that Okinawa is, right? So Okinawa is struggling against the US and the Japanese government, whereas Guahan is struggling against the US government in terms of these military plans. And so this effort to challenge the military bases is really important. It's creating solidarity that continues today. Protehi Letexan just in the fall of 2020, so a few months back, also is pursuing the efforts at other levels, at the international level with the United Nations, calling on the rights of Indigenous peoples declaration and other elements of the United Nations to continue to support the cause, to challenge what's ultimately happening is the US military buildup is happening without the exercise of self-determination from the Chamorro people, from the native inhabitants of Guahan, And this is actually in violation of international law. I'm not an international legal expert, but I do know that it's a complicated situation, of course. We can talk more about that in Q&A, but one of the things that I'm highlighting here is how there are these different levels and layers that people are trying to use, and they're using, I think, somewhat effectively to be able to say, okay, at the local level, here's what we can do, kind of regionally, here's what we're trying at the international level, because being able to communicate our struggles at these different levels really hopefully will increase the possibility that that something will be done towards actually having decolonial futures without military violence. And so I'll provide you with this example too, kind of going back to this group, Save Takai. So the US obviously, as I've kind of brushed over quite a bit, but the US has a well established and ongoing pattern of using the islands and atolls all throughout Micronesia and other sites around the world as part of its military training. Save Takai is a group that's working specifically to raise voice about what's happening with the helipad construction in the northern part of Okinawa. And I think that's very important because, like I said, at the beginning, we're thinking about maybe the context. March 1st being Nuclear Remembrance Day. A decade ago, Kiribati scholar Tiara said that the Pacific Ocean still churns with colonial and nuclear legacies. Those are still things that we are dealing with today, and that the Pacific presence in US America tends to come about because of military activity and exploitative resource extraction, like we're seeing with the efforts to construct pipelines and the way that the military bases are being used throughout the world. And so how do we deal with all of this, right? Recognizing that the US military is often the one that masks its own environmental damage, even though its Pentagon emissions and all of the routine daily activities actually exceed entire industrialized countries. So one of my hopes is in talking about some of these groups, is to share their stories, but also to bring a critique to bear on the military when we're talking about the environment, because it's really one of those sneaky, but also pretty obvious things that the military is destroying the environment. And they're not necessarily being talked about when people are talking about even things like climate change or people on the front lines of environmental justice. We really need to also include in that conversation a conversation about the military as a polluter. So how do we do that? Well, I've got a couple of clips. I'm watching time, because sometimes I'm on island time, so I'm watching time. I've got a couple of short clips I'm hoping will work to share with you. And these come directly from the organization. And there's a couple of groups. One is Save Takai, and then another one that's connected to them is the Residents Society Against the Helipads. And so if you'll bear with me, I'll try to stop my share for just a moment and get us to see the videos in the clips. And like I said, I can share these resources again afterwards as well. My friends in Takai have helped me share these messages by putting some English subtitles on these clips. So if you don't speak Japanese like me, I do not speak it. So it's helpful to have these. And if I can, sorry, one moment, I'm trying to navigate all this.
And Tiara, feel free to take time. We have until 1:45.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then for anyone, if you have questions, feel free to interject or type it in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I want to tell you, I'm learning quite a bit, and I think thank you for bringing this to light, because I think, when we talk about environmental issues, we don't often focus on the military being one of the biggest polluters. So this has been enlightening for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's tricky, and one of the things I'm hoping as I've shared this video clip, and let me pull it up for you, just to give you some context. The places in Okinawa that I was able to see and experience when I went with the International Women's Network for a meeting in Okinawa in 2017, and some of my colleagues from Hawaii and Puerto Rico and Guahan, a lot of folks were there. It was really telling that there's so many different ways that we're kind of, I would say, underexposed to what's happening. And particularly in Okinawa, it really caught my attention because there are ways that you can navigate or be taken around, as I was at my first time, and never see elements of the military. And it's kind of strategically set up that way. So this is a video from, excuse me, the Resident Society. And I'll just pull this up for us here. They're talking about, I'll give a little bit of background. They're talking about this issue that happened just earlier this year, just a few months ago. And let me get my cursor in the right spot. And their concern is that there's a new area where the US military and the Japanese Defense Forces, security forces, are hoping to practice their helipad landing operations and training without really alerting the residents. And another reason for me personally to think about these things is that even though the US military is moving a lot of its Marines and its infrastructure and all those things I mentioned at the beginning, they're moving from Futenma military base to Guam, to Hawaii, to Australia. At the same time, in this other part of Okinawa, the military is doing these operations of the helipad construction. And so you'll see in the clip, there are some actual small examples of the helipads and the noise and things that these aircraft can create. And so I'll just let them speak for themselves a little bit to share that story. Let me just open this up again to share my screen. Okay.
And then Tiara, there's also a question in the chat.
Okay, I'll read that while this is going. Yeah, thank you. And then maybe that will be away. Okay. So.
キャンプシュワブが陸自配備っていう話が突然降って湧いて出たけど、非常に全部リンクしてるの。ブルービーチが動き出した、陸自配備が表に出てきた、これが表に出てきた。そういう意味で軍事化が進んでるっていうのを、もしネットで見てる方にやっぱり発信したいのは、今日本ってコロナ禍で自主規制しながら頑張ってる人はいっぱいいるけど。税金をこういうところに使われてるっていうのをやっぱりみんなが認識しないととんでもないことですよね。我々国民苦しんでるのに。だけど誰も知らない。メディアが発表しないですよね、この件に関して。これやっぱりネットで気づいた人がどんどん発信してもらいたいですね。
こういった場所が孤立しないで、小さい力でも発信したり連帯したり、
問題は
少しずつでもやっていくっていう、
根っこは一緒なんだからできるだけこうつながりを持って、一つの点同士がいっぱいあって、それを線にして、そしたら線がこうつながれば面になるんだから、
そういう可能性をみんなで共有できたらと思います。
だから移設とかじゃなくてやっぱり軍事をなくしていくっていうことですよね。
軍隊が
ね、もう世界から
武器自体もいらないっていうような方向性に持っていかないと、
世界から軍事をなくすためにみんなで力を合わせて頑張りましょう。
So, you know, this, I think I stopped my screen. Should I stop my screen share? I apologize.
Yeah, you stopped the screen share.
Okay. There's multiple screens are always so fun. Okay.
ありがとうございます。
So, this example, I think, kind of connects to the question I see in the chat. So I'll see if I can answer that for you, Rachel. Thinking about access to sources that show environmental damage caused by the military. What are alternative sources when the military limits access to these kinds of materials? And this video, the longer video, actually shows that these residents of Takai actually found this spot and were like, this seems like a place where the military might be trying to create another helipad landing, training area, but they haven't informed the community. They haven't received prior consent. And so it's really a pressure on the community, of course, to be diligent about what's going on when they aren't receiving the information. One of the things that I've been really getting in terms of access to sources, a couple of things, actually, I should say. So, and I'm happy to share these resources as well. At Brown University, there's an institute called the Watson Institute, and they have a cost of war project, and it looks at investigative reporting and reports that are pretty easily digestible, even if they're academic sources, that talk about the pollutants of the military, the cost of war in terms of, say, veterans or, troop deployment and those kinds of things. And they've been doing that work for quite a while. Catherine Letts is one of the professors that's involved in that at Brown at the Watson Institute. There's a recent book that came out that actually John Mitchell, I believe is the author, and I haven't had a chance to read the whole thing, but his work was featured in The Guardian because the book is called Poisoning the Pacific. And he actually went through and did a webinar about the research that he did in that book, and it required him using a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests. So he had to do a lot of FOIA requesting, and as a journalist, he's done those kinds of things before, but it took him quite a while to just get the bare minimum information from these military sources. And so I'm grateful for folks like him that have done this kind of work, because he's also now created a website and just put everything that he has, sort of like a treasure trove of sorts, an archive for folks to be able to access the information from areas of the Pacific, but also a lot of his work has been around Okinawa. And the Fukushima nuclear crisis that happened recently. Well, I guess this is the 10-year anniversary. So there's a lot of stuff right out there that you really do kind of have to find it. And I'm happy to share more also later. But off the top of my head, I'm thinking of that book by John Mitchell called Poisoning the Pacific, and his website, and also the Watson Institute. It's called Costs of War. And then there's a number of other people, not as many as you might think, but that are really trying to bring critique to bear with their research around the US military in particular, and to think about the US as an empire of military bases. And I believe that phrase is more from David Vine's work, and I think he's at American University. So those are off the top of my head, but I'm happy to share more later too. Yeah. Okay, so if we do have a little bit of time, then it sounds like I can show one other piece, which is another kind of call to action from our friends in Takai. And just again to remind you that the area where these helipads are being constructed in Okinawa is in the Yanbaru National Forest. Okay, and just like I was saying about Letexan being such an important site in Guahan, where they're trying to put a live fire training range near a freshwater aquifer with a lot of our history and a number of species that are really only endemic to the Mariana Islands live in that area, right? And so the parallels are so striking to me, and the similarities that these helipads are being constructed in the Yanbaru Forest, which is on the list to try to become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and yet it's the place where clear cutting is happening and training and testing is happening, and it's up to the folks like the residents of Takai to really try to get the word out there, So these kinds of forest environments and amazing, important environmental elements for the world are also the target, right? And I think, like I said, I kind of mentioned that very briefly, but we can connect that to so many struggles here in Turtle Island, like thinking about, and I've been thinking about the Enbridge Line 3, because that project is such a large project that, looking at oil pipelines and the spills and the connections across, North America, just for how those kinds of impacts extractive industries, and then these other kinds of ways that the environment is being put kind of on the line, right? So I'm going to show this brief clip. I'm trying to find I have a little timestamp so I don't show too much of it, but I'm happy to share again the full effect. So we'll watch a couple of minutes of this video. And this is another one that was made by the group in Takai. And one of the things that they're really trying to get people to do is to watch the video and to share it. So I thought, what better way to do that and to tell you all about it, and then maybe you all can share it as well. Okay, so let's get here. I'll click okay. All right. just a couple minutes of this.
奄美大島とか沖縄島などの、琉球列島にだけ生息している琉球列島固有種ですね。もし可能だったらね、皆さん胸毛も狙って取ってください、ね。ワイルドな胸毛が生えてるんで。
もう一匹来た。
本当だ、なんか。これいい。
こんにちは。ヘリパッドいらない住人の会です。今日は12月23日、座り込み今日で最後になります。皆さんが住民の会の畑で育てた山芋の収穫がこんな大きいのが取れました。今年もとってもいろんなことがありました。ヘリパッドが完成してしまったとか、その中でもう訓練が強化したとか、もう本当にいろんなことがあって、もう打開は終わってしまったっていうような、そういうイメージもある中で、でも実はまだまだ本当に打開は終わってなくて、私たちが声を上げ続けることはすごい大事なことだなと改めて実感した1年です。それでは、またこの1年を振り返って、木保さんと清水さんに対談をしていただきたいと思います。
こんにちは。清水さん、今年はどんな1年でした？
今年はヘリパッドが完成してしまったということと、あと米軍が訓練が激化したのを見たと。
そうね、いろんな廃棄物が返還跡地から発見されて、米軍のダメさがよく分かった1年でした。
来年はどんなことを伝えたいんですか？
訓練場撤去まで我々は諦めずに頑張るぞとアピールしていきたいですね。杉野さん。
YouTube も使ってですね、いろんな人たちとつながってみんなで基地いらないと国分連場撤去ということを訴えていきたいと思います。
今日は座り込み最後の日なんですけれども、最後の日に本県に訪問してくれた北本をご紹介します。
Sorry, I was trying to end it at the last message where Kino was saying that we need to end the military bases and no more northern training area, right? So, and one of his wishes for 2021 is to share these messages, to communicate further, what's going on in Sakai. We don't need military bases, remove the northern training area. And this is, I hope, something that you all caught on to was that in a lot of ways, these messages, across these different areas are really kind of saying some of the same things, right? That, even during the time of COVID-19 and the pandemic and a lot of shutdowns, one thing that hasn't stopped is the US military. They haven't stopped their training exercises. They haven't stopped their war games. They haven't stopped their construction. In fact, they've been ramping them up. And in part, that's been authorized by the US federal government to increase military spending, right? And so there's a lot more that can be said, but in the interest of making sure we have a chance to have a conversation and also to think more, I think, about the solidarity elements, right? I'll end with a couple of other fun pictures, to take us further on that journey that I said we're going to go to a couple of places. And one of those things I wanted to just kind of share again is, so I have myself been trying to think about how to communicate these messages. And one thing I tried this past fall and will probably keep up is to write op-eds, sort of shorter, more public facing work that can really translate the research and the events and the actions of people on the ground. And my friend who's helped with these videos in terms of translating and putting some subtitles and those things to get the messages out, has also been doing that kind of work to share these messages. So on the left is a short op-ed that I wrote that really digs into more of that military and environmental destruction. And then on the right is, my friend has put this up on her blog in Japanese so that it could be a conversation that also engages more. Because even as I talked about at the beginning, there aren't a lot of conversations around what's happening in Guahan. And that's actually a thing that I've been learning in my work with my friends in Takai and with these other international organizations, is that Guahan isn't really talked about very much in the places that are moving the military there, right? Like in Japan, in Okinawa. And so these kind of solidarity efforts are really important because it helps us tell stories, right? So this image of folks that are wearing the Pratehi Lateksan shirts that are from that organization that went to Takai and connected with people in the region to learn more about the helipad construction, to share stories about, what's happening in the Yanbaru forest and what's happening in Lateksan. And I think those are really important stories to make sure that we share. So yeah, so then I'll leave it at that. Sitsus Masi, thank you so much. Here's another wonderful picture, just so we have a sense of oceanic connections before we chat further. Yeah, thank you all. And let me go ahead and stop my screen share so that we can talk story a bit more.
Thank you so much. Wow, that was such deep and expansive content. So I know we have some scholars here too, and some folks that have connection to the Pacific Islands. Feel free to interject, but I know I learned quite a bit, and you're right. This isn't something that gets amplified in the news, and I feel like during the pandemic, we've been so consumed with the cases and the death that a lot of things are happening that I think sometimes they take advantage of the lack of publicity on some of these other pressing issues. And so I was just curious on how the military was able to acquire and be able to move, build the helipads. I mean, what was that land just open space, or was it private property? I just am really curious on what we could do to amplify what's happening by the military, but I'm just shocked at their blatant possession and progress without accountability.
Yeah, I will say first and foremost, like I've been kind of working with this group off and on since 2017 through the International Women's Network Against Militarism, and I'm still learning myself, but my understanding is like a lot of people when they hear about, like Okinawan resistance to the U.S. military, the discussion has often been about like Henoko, right? Like they'll talk about Henoko. You've heard about people like advocating for the saving of the dugong and the issues that are happening there. So in some parts you might have caught maybe very briefly, but in the longer whole videos, they're each about 7 or 8 minutes, but they discuss that these are military returned lands. So there's some thing that maybe there's another term for it, but I've heard it called kind of more of a bait and switch, right? So, okay, we'll decrease the US military presence at Futenma, by scattering this military infrastructure throughout the Pacific or throughout these other places. And so it seems like demilitarization is happening, or it seems like, and I should have shared at the beginning if I didn't, but it's also in a lot of my research is like this military buildup I'm talking about just for Guahan is like actually more than just for that area. And it's been going on like planning by the US and the Japanese governments without our consent since like 2006. So this has been a long time coming, and pieces have been moving and changing over time. The issue that's happening with the helipads, from my understanding, is it's more of an agreement between the United States military and the security defense forces in Japan. And because it's a smaller village. The resident society for a helipad-free Takai is basically just the villagers that live there, and several of them are the same ones that you would see if you go there today that were on those videos. And I think I'm not entirely sure about the answer to like sort of the factual question that you asked about, like how are they able to acquire this land? But I do know that some of the things that we've seen across different areas where the military returns land is that they're contaminated lands, right, that are returned, or when they're returned with caveats. So it was told to me when I went to visit Takai that they returned a bunch of land in exchange for being able to build helipads. So what outwardly to me, it's like, oh, okay, I could see how a government or a group of peoples might agree, right? That's a difficult thing to say, but you might agree to say, yeah, we'll take this land back, even though it's contaminated, even though it needs healing, even though we haven't been able, we don't even know what we'll do with it. But it was sort of like that bait and switch. Like these lands were returned to the people. So you also have to deal with this helipad construction, and it's experimental. We still know the effects of these helipad helicopters. We know there's a lot of noise pollution. There's a ton of concern about what that's doing for the environment in the Yanburu forest, not just the clear cutting to make the landing pads, but just, disruption of you saw those beetles. I love how Akina, the researcher, was like, they're really cute. It's something that's exciting, and it's unique and endemic to that area. And yet there's a decision to put experimental aircraft on it, So I probably went too long and didn't really answer your question about all of that, but
thank you. I'll open up the floor for other questions.
Thank you so much, Tiara, for joining us. It's great to finally hear you speak and to hear your knowledge. So thank you for being with us. And I don't think I have a question. I just have a lot of thoughts going in through my head because, I don't know much about Guahan at all. And but a lot of what you described, there are, as you put it, so many parallels and connections to what's going on in Hawaii with militarism, right? I mean, what you just said about the sort of return of lands, right? I'm thinking about Kaho'olawe, right? And how that was like bombed to hell, and then the military, left, at least that part, right? But then I think I like the point that you just made, right? What appears to be scaling back in one area doesn't mean that it's scaling back as a whole. It actually is just about moving somewhere else, right? And bringing the same problems there. And so I really appreciated that, in your talk. I think that I get a sense that you've outlined a number of different modes of politics that's happening, right? Like there's like the kind of direct response and direct opposition. And we saw that a lot of that in the videos that you shared, particularly, your own work, the work of other activists and so on. I also saw the importance of insisting on the value and importance of place and the kinds of connections and modes of being that were established prior to the arrival of like US empire and military, and how those connections persist. And then I saw the connections that are being made through different places, around the Pacific. And so I thought that was, it was really stunning. And you've given us a lot of different sort of modalities at which these politics play out, and in everyday ways too, and I think I appreciate that, it's like that you're really bridging the academic and the more public kind of facing and showing the ways in which actually really sophisticated, I think, forms of political activity are happening on the ground. Like, I'm just rambling now, but one thing that, in that first video, I think that you showed, where it's, there's the group of activists that are on the side of the road, they're doing an interview, and then like they get interrupted by that huge truck that passes by, right? And I think that one thing I noticed though was like the soundtrack that came on after that, right? And the place of the ukulele, right, which is typically associated with Hawaiian music. And so there we have like this other sort of sonic dissonance, right, where it's like there's the noise pollution of the military, and then there's this other connection that's being made through sound and through music across different sites. And I thought that, you know, the poem you shared about our Commonwealth, and that, you know, that you can't sacrifice one island for the sake of the whole. And I'm just thinking about how that scales through the Pacific as well, right? You can't sacrifice one archipelago for other areas of the Pacific and so on. So, and I'm rambling because I think, you know, there was so much richness in your talk. And so now my brain's scattered all over the place. And I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It's nice to finally connect even remotely. I know we messaged before, and we have a lot of overlap with folks and thinking too. So, you know, that's kind of why I was thinking, you know, even when Soyun said, like, it's a heavy time, it's a heavy day, we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're on Zoom and we're not able to eat and talk story together. And there's a loss there, there's a grief there, but there's also like, wow, I've been able to connect with these groups in a different kind of way than I you know, maybe didn't even imagine possible. And their work continues, right? And I hadn't thought about the soundtrack as much of like a kind of oppositional soundtrack to the military noises, but it is jarring. You know, I probably should have warned you all a little bit more, but like, it's jarring to think that like, that's their everyday in Takai, right? Like that's a public road that they have to take their, you know, family members to the doctor or to go do their everyday things. And that's the kind of confrontation that they're dealt with. And we don't, you know, I shouldn't say we, but like, it is a connection, right? Like it's a commonality. And I think really going back to Rachel's question in the chat is like, when I started really doing the work around looking at the military buildup in Wuhan, I had to just remember, like, this isn't just right here, right? And there's a reason. If we're talking about the US military buildup in the Marianas and not talking about what's happened in Okinawa and the, you know, sexual violence and the noise pollution and all the different things that, you know, the Okinawan anti-base movement has been doing for decades, right? Then we're not doing anyone any favors. Like if we can't all be free, then what's the point? So I think that's the other thing that's been really helpful to connect with the friends in Takai is that they're saying, oh my gosh, we have a lot to learn about Wuhan too. Like they just kind of thought that the conversation was like, oh, I guess Guam wants it. It's already kind of a military base. And so to really have those conversations with each other and to be able to do these exchanges when people could do them, you know, to go to each other's lands and to experience that's a really powerful piece too. Yeah. So thanks. I actually have a lot of receipts on the military and the environment, Rachel, if you want more. I have a lot.
Yeah, I'm sure it could be a rabbit hole because they love to produce records. They just don't love to give access to them, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking about something else that Chad said was that it's interesting. Some of the most sustainable like policies and programs that are happening in Hawaii are military funded. Right, big grants, big money. You know, our universities are definitely wrapped up in the military funding apparatus. The lands that we're on, you know, all the different kind of webs and interwoven connections of that are ways to pay attention. But it's also been a strategy. It's sort of like this greenwashing that you've probably heard about before with other corporations and companies. And then you put in the largest military on the planet. And of course, they've had policies that have been doing that kind of work, and strategically so for quite a while. And my new-ish thing is to now make sure I can understand the connections when it comes to like disasters, because I mentioned Fukushima and talking about Nuclear Remembrance Day. But like the military also gets oftentimes, and we've seen this, you know, in wildfire situations, even in Colorado or California, like the military gets deployed as being who better to serve and protect the environment than the military. But to me, it's like you're talking out of both sides of your mouth because you're not protecting the environment when you destroy it, right? And it's very complicated to have those conversations. Like I mentioned too, it's like my whole family's like military enlisted, and I went to school on some military scholarships, and you know, but I think those are the same kinds of conversations we have to have, because we are producing generations and generations of veterans and struggle really because of the military for the future to come, you know. So I don't have the exact numbers. You might have, in that op-ed I showed on the screenshot, that was a little bit of just a fire in my belly because I had been reading about the USS Roosevelt and the way that the US military kind of just gets to unfettered access. So they landed in Guam. They had they had cases, you may have heard of this back in May, but they had a lot of cases. They unloaded their entire ship into hotels, really puts the community at risk, and there's not much a US territory can do, supposedly, right? So I think that always just kind of pushing back against like what can be done, and showing these different levels of how people are actually activating, that's an important piece. So.
Well, thank you again. This was so informative and educational. We really appreciate you, enlightening us. And maybe if when you have time, you can send us a slide, and I'd be happy to send it to folks in our small circle right here. Gracie, thank you for co-sponsoring the event. Did you have any last minute words?
I did. I just wanted to say thank you so much again for coming today and for sharing and enlightening. And I have so many thoughts around your presentation too, and just all the parallels across Indigenous world and Indigenous communities, and just the militarization. So if it's not the military, then it's the energy transfer people hiring the security firms that are militarized. If it's not that, then it's the police forces that are militarized, always against our people, the people of color and Indigenous people. And so it's just just another example of all the parallels and the attack on Indigenous communities. And when they're attacking the Indigenous communities, they're actually attacking, our worlds go hand in hand with the natural world, with grandmother Earth, Mother Earth, and the waters, the grandmother waters, and the grandfather rocks, and the landforms and all of that. So it's attack on not just us, but on our land, our world that we live on. So it's just they're just so sneaky too, right? They just have all these tricks up their sleeves, and yeah, we'll give you this if we can build these helipads here. Yeah, it's just really emotional and angering, but it's important. I like what you said about, even though we're on Zoom and during this pandemic, it has provided such a wonderful way to connect and to get that we might not have been able to receive if we were still in person. So I've been able to have meetings with elders in different communities, and I would not have had that opportunity if we weren't all on Zoom. So there's give and take with the world that we're in right now. I really loved how you showed the water and the landforms and the names, the traditional names of those places, and the creation stories, and how we're so spiritually connected to these places that they just don't get it. They just don't get it, and I don't know if they ever will. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. And yeah, I just love that you were able to come and share today. And thank you again so much. And thank everyone else for coming.
Yeah, thank you, Gracie. It's really, really great to be connected with you and to be invited. And I think one thing I didn't say, I don't know, maybe I did, but I often like to try to remember the lot of signs of it seems like maybe a lot of signs of the success of colonization. You might, one could look at this whole thing and say, oh my gosh, they're so successful. And like you said, so sneaky. But really, I like to flip it and say, this is actually all the signs of failure of colonization and the pushes for decolonization through these different efforts from our places and from our knowledge that can't be contained. So,
right. One last thing I remember hearing was the woman's voice. She said, we got to get rid of the military. Yeah. We got to get rid of all of them. And then the older gentleman, he said, we will never give up. Continue to fight. And that's the warrior spirit of our people, Indigenous people. They have that spirit, and that's so inspiring and just wonderful to hear.
Yeah. Great. Thank you all again. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for all of you for attending. Convene again.
I'll stop this and share it. I guess I forgot about that.